Some concluding thoughts on a day when so many important thoughts have been expressed. Elie Wiesel said, "Nuremberg is the story of those who did the killing. Nuremberg is also the story of those who did nothing." It's quite a story about inhumanity, about immorality, about indifference, a story with many lessons to teach. But the past 7 decades have shown how few of them the world has wanted to learn. The lawyer in me, the judge in me, the child in me, the mother in me, the Jew in me, each part of me reacted differently to different parts of the Nuremberg story. To me, the issue was about justice itself. And in the end, thinking about this talk, what troubled me most was how little justice there had been. The lawyer in me was offended, and so was the judge. But no part of me resonated more as I learned the Nuremberg story. No part despaired more than the Jew in me. My justice journey, in fact, my life's journey, started with the injustices revealed at Nuremberg. Who I am, what I believe in, and what I hope for, all started with the Holocaust. 200,000 European Jews survived the Holocaust. 3 of them were my parents and grandmother. I am proud of many things in my life, but nothing makes me prouder than to be the child of Holocaust survivors. And one of them was a graduate of this historic university. My father came to the Jagiellonian University in Krakow to study law in 1930. Because there was a numerus clausus, a quota on the number of Jews admitted to the law school, he was one of very few Jews admitted in a class of over 100. Rather than sit in the seats reserved for Jewish students in the lectures, he told me he stood through most of his first year at the university. He graduated in 1934. After he finished his 8 years of legal training, he married my mother on September the 3rd, 1939. He never got to practice law in Poland. He and my mother spent 4 years in concentration camps. Their 2.5-year-old son, and my father's parents, and 3 younger brothers died at Treblinka. My father was the only person in his family to survive the war. He was 35 when the war ended. My mother was 28. As I reached each of those ages, I tried to imagine how they faced an unknown future as survivors of an unimaginable past. And as each of our 2 sons reached the age my brother had been when he was killed, I tried to imagine my parents' pain at losing a 2-year-old, and I couldn't. After the war, my parents went to Germany, where the Americans hired my father, who had taught himself English, as a defense counsel for displaced persons in the Allied zone in southwest Germany, and was made head of the Jewish community in Stuttgart. In an act that seems to me to be almost incomprehensible in its breathtaking optimism, my parents and thousands of other survivors transcended the inhumanity they had experienced and decided to have more children. I was born in 1946, and my sister in 1948. I think it was a way to fix their hearts and to prove to themselves and the world that their spirits were not broken. My father applied to emigrate to Canada, but was refused because his European legal training wasn't considered a useful skill. When we were finally given permission to go to Canada in 1950, he applied to practice law. He was told by the Law Society that he couldn't be admitted to the bar because he wasn't a Canadian citizen. That would have taken 5 years, so he became an insurance agent to support his family. I never heard him complain about not being able to practice his profession. But the moment I heard the story about his being denied the ability to be a lawyer was the moment I decided to become one. I was 4 years old. The lack of lament or complaint in my home growing up was, as I look back on it, extraordinary. No bitterness, no anger, no fear, only hope. I understood none of this, of course, until I became a parent myself. In fact, I simply didn't appreciate growing up the full horror of what had happened to my parents during World War II. All I knew was how incredibly lucky I was to have such wonderful, loving, and positive people as parents. They told me whenever I asked, and never with tears, what it had been like in concentration camp, what it felt like when they learned that their 2-year-old son had been killed at Treblinka, and what it meant to lose everything and almost everyone and start all over again. But while my parents never forgot how lucky they were to be able to restart their lives in a vibrant democracy, neither did they ever forget why they had to, nor should we. They had to because the rule of law turned into the law of injustice. The world was supposed to have learned 3 indelible lessons from the concentration camps of Europe. 1, indifference is injustice's incubator. 2, it's not just what you stand for, it's what you stand up for. And 3, we must never forget how the world looks to those who are vulnerable. Those were the lessons the Nuremberg trial exposed. My formative years were spent in the shadow of Nuremberg. I was born in Germany at the beginning of the trials, surrounded by the survivors for whom it was created, nurtured by parents who had somehow escaped the final Nazi verdict, and watched a father help try to create a system of justice for people who didn't know such a thing could exist in Germany for Jews. I grew up with a passion for justice and democracy, but I have also, now that I am grown up, developed a sadness for what has become of them despite Nuremberg. I never asked my parents if they took any comfort from the Nuremberg trials, which were going on for 4 of the 5 years we were in Germany. I have no idea if they got any consolation from the convictions of dozens of the worst offenders. But of this I am very sure. They would have preferred by far that the sense of outrage that inspired the Allies to establish the military tribunal of Nuremberg had been aroused many years earlier, before the events that led to Nuremberg ever took place. They would have preferred, I'm sure, that world reaction to the 1933 Reichstag fire decree, suspending whole portions of the Weimar Constitution, to the expulsion of Jewish lawyers and judges from their professions that same year, to the 1935 Nuremberg laws prohibiting social contact with Jews, or to the brutal rampage of Kristallnacht in 1938. They would have preferred, I'm sure, that world reaction to any of these, let alone all of them, would have been at the very least public censure. But there was no such world reaction. By the time World War II officially started, on September the 3rd, 1939, the day my parents got married, it was too late. And so the vitriolic language and venal rights abuses, unrestrained by anyone, turned into the ultimate rights abuse, genocide. Millions of lives were lost because no one was offended enough by the systematic destruction of every conceivable right for Jews in Germany that they felt the need for any form of response. And so the vitriolic language and venal rights abuses turned into the ultimate rights abuse, genocide. Consider some of the events that have occurred around the world since then, notwithstanding the most sophisticated development of international law, treaties, and conventions the international community has ever known, all stating that rights abuses will not be tolerated. We had the genocide in Rwanda, the massacres in Bosnia and the Congo, the violent expropriations and sheer immorality of Zimbabwe, the slaughter, rape, and child soldiers in Sudan, the annihilation of the rights of women by the Taliban, the attempted genocide of the Kurds in Iraq, the rampant racism tolerated at the UN World Congress Against Racism and Intolerance in Durban, China, Myanmar, Pakistan, Darfur, the nuclear roguery of North Korea, and the roguery period in Iran. And now, our latest disgraceful chapter in global insensitivity as the world formulates a strategy of astonishingly glacial and anemic proportions in Syria. Clearly, what remains elusive is our willingness as an international community to protect humanity from injustice. We clearly still have not learned the most important lesson we were supposed to learn from the Holocaust, to try to prevent the abuses in the first place. All over the world, in the name of religion, national interest, economic exigency, or sheer arrogance, men, women, and children are being murdered, abused, imprisoned, terrorized, and exploited with impunity. I think lawyers like me have a tendency to take some comfort, properly so, in the possibility of subsequent judicial reckoning, such as occurred at Nuremberg. But is subsequent justice really an adequate substitute for justice? I don't for one moment want to suggest the Nuremberg trials weren't important. Of course they were. They were a crucial and heroic attempt to hold the unimaginably guilty to judicial account, and they showed the world the banality of evil and the evil of indifference. But although Nuremberg represented a sincere commitment to justice, it was a commitment all too fleeting. Not for long did the prosecution of war crimes remain a magnetic national preoccupation for the Western allies who created it in the intimidating shadow of the Holocaust. By 1948, Britain issued a communique to the Commonwealth countries putting an end to the attempt to prosecute Nazi war crimes as a response to recent tripartite talks about political developments in Germany. We are convinced, the British communique said, that it is now necessary to dispose of the past. The crisis in Berlin with Russia thereby turned Germany from an enemy to be restrained into a prospective ally to be recruited. By 1949, it was all over. No more Nuremberg trials, no more Nazi war crimes prosecutions anywhere in the Western world for over 2 decades, and the early release of many of the convicted war criminals who had been sentenced at Nuremberg. The past was tucked away, and the moral comfort of the Nuremberg trials gave way to the amoral expedient of the Cold War. With stunning alacrity, the world abandoned what proved to be its temporary pursuit of justice at Nuremberg and reconstituted itself within 5 years as if neither Nuremberg nor the Holocaust had ever happened. It was a collective form of repressed memory. Why hasn't the Holocaust, the single most outrageous crime in civilized history, created a desperate, unquenchable thirst for enforceable international norms that make human rights abuses intolerable anytime and anywhere? The gap between the values the international community articulates and the values it enforces is so wide that almost any country that wants to can push its abuses through it. No national abuser seems to worry whether there'll be a Nuremberg trial later, because usually there isn't. And in any event, by the time there is, all the damage that was sought to be done has already been done. In too many parts of the world, there are no regrets, no tolerance, no justice, and no hope. Those parts of the world are putting the rest of the world in danger because intolerance, the world's fastest growth industry, seeks in its hegemonic insularity to impose its intolerant truth on others. Yet all too often, we appear reluctant as a global community to call to meaningful account the intolerant countries who abuse their citizens, and instead hide behind silencing concepts like cultural relativism, domestic sovereignty, or root causes. These are concepts that excuse injustice. Silence in the face of injustice means that injustice wins. We changed the world's institutions and laws after World War II because they had lost their legitimacy and integrity. Are we there again? Is it time to ask the hard questions about the United Nations as a deliberative body? I think it is. The UN was the institution the world set up to implement never again. Its historical tutor was the Holocaust, yet it seems hardly to have been an eager pupil. What was never supposed to happen again has, again and again. The UN had 4 objectives: to protect future generations from war, to protect human rights, to foster universal justice, and to promote social behavior. Since then, 40 million people have died as a result of conflicts in the world. Nations debate, people die. Nations dissemble, people die. Nations defy, people die. We need more than the words of justice. We need justice. In these frenetically fluid, intellectually sclerotic, economically narcissistic, ideologically polarized, and rhetorically tempestuous times, a world that too often feels like it's spinning out of control, really can't afford to be complacent about the absence of multilateral leadership to make sure the compass stays pointed in the most rights-oriented direction. I think the global community needs to rethink the morality of its almost reflexively protective attitude towards this institutional behemoth, stop making excuses for its inexcusable and seemingly infinite patience for injustice, and start insisting that it do the job it was set up to do. We're the generation that bears the historical weight of the Holocaust pain, the generation whose commitment to justice was the phoenix that rose from the ashes of Auschwitz. How many more outrages will our generation witness before we lose the final victim, our humanity? The arc of the moral universe may be long, but it decidedly and increasingly does not always bend toward justice. Why does that matter? Because it means that too many children will never get to grow up, period, let alone grow up in a moral universe that bends towards justice. Our outrage over World War II inspired us to hold the Nuremberg Trials. This memory should be all we need to keep the fire lit under human rights, the memory of the horror when they do not exist. My life started in a country where there had been no democracy, no rights, no justice. It created an unquenchable thirst in me for all three. My father died a month before I finished law school, but not before he had taught me that democracies and their laws represent the best possibility of justice, and that those of us lucky enough to be alive and free have a particular duty to our children to do everything possible to make the world safer for them than it was for their grandparents, so that all children, regardless of race, religion, or gender, can wear their identities with pride, in dignity, and in peace. Thank you, Irwin and Alan, for the honor of including me in this historic conference.